52 food, so he's now broken. Granted, some units are training, but he's technically up 15 food, and he's going to start training more units as he makes this push. And in a lot of ways, and as you're going to see soon in this final fight, the game is basically over. The elf player able to get an expansion up like this, and then taking units away from the orc over and over and over again, has put him in a really great situation. And what I think is interesting, and what I think a lot of us should pay attention to and note, is that the reason why the elf is in such a great situation really does come from the early game that took place. The comment on this replay on the very front page actually says that the elf has a terrible startup, and I disagree. If you look, I mean, taking out 2 workers, putting damage on the lodge, wasting so much time for the orc, really put the orc behind critically for dots to become an option. And whenever dots become an option on this strong of a level, you can see what happens. It's pure destruction of the orc army. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because the elf basically can attack move his hunts at the enemy's army, right? So these hunts do bouncing damage. The panda does Drunken Haze, reducing the DPS of the enemy army, and the Breath of Fire, which then goes through, and the effect of Breath of Fire is it puts mass damage on all the units. So even if these units were spirit-linked, well, they're just spreading damage that gets spread anyways. And there you saw the Breath of Fire. I mean, this front raider is pretty screwed. And boom, another raider is screwed. Over and over again, these units just start dropping from this sheer DPS. And whenever you talk about mass DPS, these dryads, you know, they run around, they put a dot on units that slows them, slows their attack speed, and also damages them over time. And then you throw in Fairy Fire that makes units take extra damage and makes it where a Blade Master can't even go invisible effectively. I mean, you're talking about very, very effective DPS composition by the elf player that needs to be countered by Breakers and several other more late-game units by the orc. And whenever the orc is set up and can't get them the way that he needs to, whenever the orc is harassed effectively early on, that is such a great adaptation to move on to the game. One thing I meant to talk about there, and I'm sorry I missed it, was if you saw it, the panda, Soccer's panda, was about to go down to the Blade Master. He ran north, and he bought the priest, and he also bought the stone golem. And so he slowed the Blade Master down, and then pulled some units up, and he was able to kill the Blade Master, while still working away the orc's army. So the main things that I want you to take home from this game and really think about as you go into your own games is that elves in general are starting to adapt a lot more in terms of gameplay. Some people would argue that it's been going on for a long time. It really has, but as you start to look at games, it's popping up more and more often where instead of playing a more standard style game, an elf player sees an opportunity and he takes it. And I think being able to seize opportunities like that, and even in your own practice games, being willing to take risks for opportunities like that, is it's well worth your time for learning things that will really work out for you. I've learned that on Twisted Meadows, for example, if I get a close spawn against a human player and he has to do his shop creep right in front of me, I'll usually straight harass with my Demon Hunter and sneak double racks hunts. I'll build my second racks on my Hunter's Hall out of my base and fake it, and then I end up jumping the human when he's expoing most of the time with about 4 to 5 hunts, and the game's over because he didn't see this coming and he didn't know how to play against it. And adaptations like that will really go a long ways in helping your gameplay. And I think in this game, being able to see how the panda can be so effective against orcs, because in part because of his haze, but also because of the Breath of Fire, the mass damage, and then the combination of dots and dryads, it really is more effective than some people would like to give it credit. And there are a lot of different strategies that actually employ that concept intentionally, like the use of a warden within either a Naga or a Keeper of the Grove second is a highly effective one that I'm starting to experiment with sometimes. And I mean, in general, just bear in mind that standard isn't really, it's not what you think it is. Standard in the end is simply 2 very good players on the same level playing against each other and adapting to each other back and forth in ways that match the game. And so the result is, whenever games don't go perfectly or they don't follow those rules, or whenever one player's really got a leg up on another player, you'll see different things happen. And it's those little variations that really make this game interesting to me. And so, whenever you're playing your games, be willing to think outside the box of what you're supposed to do. If you lose a game to somebody, I mean, don't take the time to flame them and say, you're not supposed to get 6 grunts, you're obviously a dumbass. Well, if he got 6 grunts and it worked for a reason. And you need to figure out what that reason was and what you should have done differently. I mean, if you're an orc player and you're like, you're not supposed to go Demon Hunter, Double Racks, Archers, Naga. Well, if it worked against you, it worked. You need to identify what to change about your gameplay to make it okay, instead of taking the time to get upset because somebody did something different than what you expected and beat you with it. So when you're playing your games, definitely learn to start thinking outside the box, and then the real thing that I want you to start looking for is timing. We've talked about this before, but the big timing that this game represents is, number one, the elf's choice of when to push. is one of the big ones, right? Also, the elf's timing of breaking 50. He had the resources to break 50 sooner than he did, but he sat at 50 so he could pick up a few more items, and also because he knew that the orc player simply didn't have an army to beat his. I mean, if you're at 50 food and your opponent's army can't beat yours, why are you breaking 50 food? I mean, if you've got 4 expos, okay, yeah, you need to break 50 because you clearly don't have a competitive army. But if your opponent's army can't beat yours and you're right at 50 food, there's not a real need to break. Do something else with your resources. Throw down an expansion to guarantee late game, tech, get unit upgrades. I mean, do something other than reducing how much gold you get by 30%. And the last thing I want you guys to think about is just the general interplay of Warcraft 3. I mean, again, as I've talked about in other replays, Soccer went in there with a wisp and he saw that the lodge was so late that he had an option to do a non-standard strategy. And so he did. And at the same time, the orc player realized that the elf was almost certainly going to fast expand, and he was also clearly a little worried that he would have trouble stopping that expansion. So he went double bestiary instead of doing a more standard orc setup that we may be used to. Although double bestiary is, in many ways, a very normal orc strategy. But he does this so that he can run around and harass the 2 bases, hoping to get the map control he needs to turn the game back around in his favor. And in this case, it doesn't work out, but it's still something to consider. But anyways, keep working on your gameplay. At some point, I'll try and actually take the time to do an audio commentary that focuses more on early game micro. That's a very difficult thing to talk about. It's something that you learn to do, and then you just kind of do it. And there are a lot of factors that go into early game micro that are either very situational or have more to do with things not micro related. Like your base design affects your micro sometimes against undead more than your micro itself actually might. But I'll have another audio commentary coming up for you guys hopefully in about 2 weeks. WC replays. You stay classy.